In the autumn of 1792, in a defended cabin on the Kentucky frontier, during a hard skirmish with a raiding party pressing the walls, a settler named for the record only as Hargrove was reloading his long rifle for what would have been his fourth shot of the fight when the barrel of that rifle came apart in his own two hands. The ball had not gone anywhere near the enemy. It never left the muzzle at all. The gun simply burst right there in the smoke and the shouting, and Hargrove went down with his hand and forearm torn apart by his own barrel before a single one of the attackers outside ever got close enough to touch him. The men who survived that fight and wrote up the account afterward laid Hargrove's death at the feet of the raiding party the same way every death in a fight like that got laid at the feet of whoever was doing the attacking, because that is the story that makes sense to a frightened man writing it down after the fact. But the raiding party did not kill Hargrove, friend. His own rifle did, and it did it because of one small, rushed mistake he made in the middle of loading it, a mistake so common and so easy to make under pressure that it has been killing riflemen on the frontier and long after the frontier closed, for longer than anybody has been keeping a careful count. The enemy gets blamed for a great many frontier deaths that were never really his doing, the same way the wolf gets blamed and the cold gets blamed and the storm gets blamed for dangers that had nothing to do with any of them. An ambush makes a fine villain, a clean and simple story, men in the dark, a fight, a death, and nobody left with much appetite to look any closer at exactly how that death happened. But the truth, and it is a truth that shows up again and again once you know to look for it in the old accounts, is that a good many men who were counted among the casualties of frontier fights and hunts never took an enemy shot at all. Their own rifle took them in the middle of the very act of loading it because of a mistake that leaves no mark on the outside of the gun, no warning a man can see or feel by looking, and that turns a trusted weapon into something closer to a bomb held in a man's own two hands. That is the myth I am pulling apart for you tonight. The myth that a rifle in good working order and a man who knows how to load it fast are all the protection a frontiersman needs, because that exact confidence held by capable and experienced men for as long as men have carried muzzle-loading rifles has killed and maimed more of them than any war party that ever set foot on this continent, and it is still doing the exact same thing today to hunters and shooters who have never fired a single shot at another human being in their lives. Here's the twist, and I want you to sit with it before we go any further, because it is the whole spine of what I am handing you tonight. The rifle was not the enemy, not in the way you would think. A good rifle, properly loaded, will do exactly what it is built to do every single time, faithfully for years. What killed Hargrove was not his rifle failing him. It was Hargrove in the panic and the haste of a real fight, failing his rifle, skipping one small step in the loading process that takes perhaps 2 extra seconds to do correctly, and those 2 seconds, skipped under pressure, turned a sound and trustworthy weapon into something that exploded in his own hands before it ever had the chance to protect him. What Hargrove and every rifleman like him was trying to do has a name older than this country. It is called loading a muzzle-loading firearm correctly every single time, with no shortcuts, regardless of how much fear or hurry is pressing in on a man in the moment. Your great-great-grandfather, if he carried a rifle on this frontier, understood that discipline in his hands the same way he understood 100 other rules that separated the men who came home from the men who did not. I am going to walk you through every piece of that discipline tonight, plain and complete, the way it was actually practiced, every piece except the one mistake that took Hargrove, and I am handing you that piece last because it is the piece that matters most of all, and because it is the exact same piece that is still taking hands and eyes and lives today in a form most modern shooters have never once heard named. If you found yourself in a real moment of danger tonight, needing to reload any firearm fast, with your hands shaking and your mind racing, most people, then and now, would trust exactly what Hargrove trusted, and for exactly the same reason. They would load as quickly as their hands could move, skip whatever felt like it could be skipped in the name of speed, and pull the trigger, confident that a rifle either fires or it does not, with no real understanding that there is a third outcome far worse than a simple misfire, waiting for the man who loads in haste and never learns to check for it. That is the knowing we are digging back up tonight, neighbor. Not simply how to load a rifle. What one small check separates a rifle that protects a man from a rifle that turns on him at the exact moment he needs it most, and that difference is precisely what separated Hargrove from every other defender in that cabin who survived the very same fight. We will get to every bit of it. Stay with me, because this is knowledge that has quietly maimed people using firearms of every kind right up to this year, and I intend to leave you with no excuse for ever joining that number. I am Ezra Calhoun, and I have spent my whole life on a stretch of Ozark ground. My family has worked for the better part of 200 years, back in a hollow we still call Calhoun Hollow, tucked into the Missouri backcountry, where the hills fold up close and a man learns respect for a firearm before he learns much of anything else. My grandfather Gideon raised me on that ground, and he was born in 1919 and lived to be 89 years old, and he grew up around old muzzle-loading guns that had been in this family for generations before cartridge rifles ever became the common thing. Guns his own grandfather had carried and maintained, and more than once watched go badly wrong in another man's careless hands. Gideon drilled the loading discipline I'm about to hand you into me before he ever let me carry a rifle into the woods on my own, and he was not a gentle teacher about it, because this is not a lesson a man can afford to learn gently. What I know about this, I learned standing next to him at a bench, loading and reloading a rifle over and over until my hands did it right, without my mind having to think about it. The way any discipline worth having has to become instinct rather than a choice you make fresh each time. This is not something I picked up out of a book. It is something built into my hands by a man who had no patience left for shortcuts that could cost somebody their fingers. By the time we are through here tonight, you will understand why the single most dangerous moment for a rifleman on this frontier, and for a great many shooters today, was never the moment the enemy showed himself. It was the moment right before, alone with his own hands and his own rifle, loading under pressure. You will know exactly what goes wrong inside a rifle barrel when this mistake is made, and why it does not merely fail to fire, but does something far more violent instead. You will know the one physical signal, felt rather than seen, that told an old-timer whether his rifle was loaded correctly or loaded wrong, a signal so simple that almost nobody today has ever been taught to notice it. You will know the discipline the old-timers built into their hands to make sure this mistake almost never happened, even in the worst and most frightening moments a man could face. And you will know the last piece, the piece that explains why this exact danger, born on the muzzle-loading frontier, did not vanish when cartridge firearms took over. It changed shape, and in some ways it became harder to see coming, and it is still taking hands and lives today under a different name from people who have never once heard the word muzzleloader in their lives. That is where we are headed tonight, piece by piece, and I am leaving nothing out. There are 6 pieces to understanding how a rifle turns from a man's protection into his own executioner, and coming out the other side with every finger you started with every single time. 6 in order, and the order matters because this danger only makes full sense laid out front to back. The first 2 pieces, most folks who have spent real time around muzzle-loading firearms already carry some rough sense of, even without the words to explain the physics behind it. The middle pieces are where good, careful, experienced men still got caught, because the moment this danger strikes hardest is precisely the moment a man is least able to slow down and think. And the 6th piece, the last one, is the reason this old frontier danger is still very much alive today, wearing a different name, in weapons that would have looked like magic to Hargrove and every man in that cabin with him. The first piece is understanding what a rifle barrel actually is physically, and why the space inside it has to be treated with a level of respect most modern people who have never loaded a firearm from the muzzle down simply do not have reason to think about. A rifle barrel is a sealed tube, closed at one end by the breech and open at the other end where the ball or bullet leaves. And everything about how that barrel functions safely depends on one simple, unforgiving fact. When the powder charge ignites, it produces an enormous volume of expanding gas almost instantly, and that gas has exactly one path available to escape the confined space of the barrel, which is to push the ball or bullet out through the open muzzle end, converting the pressure of that expanding gas into the forward motion of the projectile. A barrel is engineered, whether by an old-time gunsmith working iron by hand or a modern factory running exacting tolerances, to handle a very specific, very well understood pressure curve, a curve built around the assumption that the powder charge and the ball sit properly in position, touching or nearly touching one another, so that the full force of that expanding gas goes to work, pushing the ball smoothly and immediately down the length of the barrel and out the muzzle. Here is the piece almost nobody outside of serious muzzle loading circles understands, and it is the entire hinge this whole danger turns on. If there is any meaningful gap of open air between the powder charge and the ball sitting above it, rather than the ball being seated firmly down against the charge the way it is supposed to be, the physics of that ignition change dramatically and dangerously. Instead of the expanding gas immediately going to work, pushing a properly seated ball smoothly forward, that gas first has to violently compress and accelerate through that open air gap before it ever makes solid contact with the base of the ball. And that sudden, violent compression across even a small gap generates a pressure spike far higher, sometimes catastrophically higher, than the barrel was ever built to handle, all concentrated at one particular point along its length. The result is not simply a rifle that fails to fire properly, it is a barrel that can rupture, split, or burst entirely at the point of that pressure spike, sending metal fragments, unburned powder, and superheated gas directly back toward the one part of the rifle a man's own body is guaranteed to be touching in that exact moment, which is the stock and the barrel itself, right where his hands are gripping it, and his face is often positioned close by to aim. This is what happened to Hargrove, and it is what has happened in one form or another to riflemen for as long as muzzle-loading firearms have existed, not a rifle simply failing to fire, which is merely inconvenient and rarely dangerous on its own. A rifle loaded with an air gap between powder and ball, fired under that condition, becomes a weapon capable of turning on the very hands holding it. And the terrible cruelty of this particular danger is that a rifle loaded this way looks from the outside exactly like a rifle loaded correctly. There is no visible sign. There is no smell. There is nothing a man can see by looking down the barrel or checking the outside of his weapon that will tell him with any certainty whether the ball sitting somewhere down that barrel is actually seated against the powder or resting an inch or two above it with open air in between. So the first piece is this, and I want it to sit heavy with you because it runs against the instinct most people have about firearms, which is that danger comes from the outside, from the enemy or the animal or the accident of a careless finger on a trigger. This danger comes from inside the barrel itself, invisible, silent, waiting for the moment a man fires the gun to reveal itself all at once and all wrong. Here is your first thing to carry out of tonight, and I will give you one at the end of every piece. A rifle that looks loaded and a rifle that is loaded correctly are not automatically the same thing, and the gap between those two states, an inch or two of open air a man cannot see or feel by casual habit, is exactly what separates a shot fired safely from a barrel that comes apart in his hands. Now, why would a man, especially an experienced one who has loaded a rifle 1,000 times before, ever end up with that dangerous gap in the first place? This brings me to the second piece, and it is the piece that turns ordinary human nature into a trap. Because the moment this mistake happens, most often is not a moment of carelessness. It is a moment of genuine, understandable fear. The second piece is haste under pressure, And this is where good men, careful men, experienced men get caught by this danger far more often than fools or beginners ever do, because the mistake is almost never a matter of not knowing how to load a rifle correctly. It is a matter of skipping one small step of a process a man knows perfectly well in a moment when every instinct in his body is screaming at him to move faster. Picture Hargrove in that cabin, an attack pressing against the walls outside, powder smoke thick in the room, his hands likely shaking with the same fear any man would feel in that position, working through the loading sequence he had done 1,000 times calmly on a hunting trip and was now trying to do in a fraction of the time, under a fraction of the composure. The full, correct loading sequence for a muzzle loading rifle requires pouring a measured powder charge down the barrel, seating a patch and ball on top of it, and then critically, using the ramrod to press that ball firmly all the way down until it makes solid, unmistakable contact with the powder charge beneath it. No gap, no daylight, ball resting directly against powder. Under calm conditions on a hunting trip or at a bench, a man does this without even thinking about it, because his hands have done it correctly so many times that the correct motion has become automatic. Under the pressure of a real fight, with an enemy at the door, and every second feeling like it could be the last one that matters, that same man's hands can move through most of that sequence correctly and simply not press the ramrod all the way home, stopping an inch or two short because his body is screaming to get the rifle back up and firing, rather than take the extra half second required to seat that ball properly and completely. This is precisely the trap, and it is a trap set entirely by the very fear that is supposed to be keeping a man sharp and alive. A frightened man's body wants speed above all else, and the loading step most likely to get shortchanged in that rush is exactly the one step, seating the ball firmly and fully, that has almost no visible or obvious consequence if skipped, right up until the trigger is pulled. Everything else in the loading sequence, missing the powder measure entirely, forgetting the ball altogether, produces an immediate and obvious problem: a rifle that plainly will not fire at all. A short-seated ball, resting an inch above the powder rather than directly against it, produces no obvious problem whatsoever in the moment of loading. The rifle looks loaded. It feels loaded. A man in a hurry, under real fear, has every reason in the world to believe he has done the job correctly, because nothing in front of him is telling him otherwise. And that false confidence is exactly what makes this the second piece of the whole danger, a trap that springs hardest on the men who most need their weapon to work, in the exact moments they are least equipped to notice they have made a mistake. Here is your second thing to carry. The most dangerous moment for this mistake to happen is not a calm, unhurried moment at a shooting bench. It is the exact moment a man is under the most pressure to load fast, which means the discipline that prevents this danger has to be strong enough to survive fear and haste, not merely strong enough to work when a man has all the time in the world and nothing pressing on him. If your hands cannot seat a ball correctly while shaking with fear in under 5 extra seconds, that discipline has not truly been built into your hands yet. It has only been built into your calm afternoons. Now, even in the rush of loading under pressure, there is one physical signal, one honest tell that would have warned Hargrove and every man like him if only he had been trained to feel for it and to trust it even in the heat of the moment. This is the third piece, and it is the piece I most want you to carry home tonight, because it is simple, it is fast, and it very likely could have saved Hargrove's hand and his life both in less time than it takes to draw one more breath. The third piece is the sound and the feel of the ramrod itself, because a properly trained hand does not need to see inside the barrel to know whether a ball is seated correctly. It can feel it and hear it through the ramrod every single time if the man holding it has been taught what he is actually listening and feeling for. When a ramrod strikes a ball that is seated firmly and completely against a full powder charge, with no gap of open air remaining between them, it produces a distinct, solid, almost musical thump, a firm and immediate stop with very little give or bounce, a sensation any experienced rifleman learns to recognize the same way a carpenter learns to recognize the solid feel of a nail driven true rather than one glancing off at an angle. When a ramrod strikes a ball that is not fully seated, when there is still open air between that ball and the powder charge beneath it, the feel and the sound are noticeably different. A softer, less solid contact, sometimes a faint hollow quality to the sound, sometimes a slight extra give or spring in the ramrod before it fully stops, the physical signature of striking something that still has a small cushion of air to compress before it makes true, solid contact with the charge below. This difference is subtle, and I want to be honest with you about that because it takes real practice to learn to feel it reliably. The same way it takes real practice to learn to feel the difference between a knife that is properly sharp and one that only looks sharp. But it is a real, physical, learnable signal. And the old timers who handled these rifles daily, whose lives genuinely depended on getting this right every single time, trained their hands to feel for exactly this difference until checking it became as automatic and unconscious as breathing. A man who has drilled this feel into his hands 1,000 times over does not have to stop and think about it in a moment of fear. His hand simply knows the instant the ramrod stops, whether that stop felt solid and true or soft and questionable, and a soft, questionable stop was the signal every single time to add one more firm stroke of the ramrod before trusting that rifle to fire safely. Here is the rule, and it is 3 lines, the same shape as always. 1. Every single time you seat a ball, whether you are calm on a hunting trip or frightened in a genuine emergency, the ramrod must be pressed down with enough force and enough attention to feel the distinct solid stop of ball against powder, not merely the general sense that the ramrod has gone down about as far as it usually does. 2. A soft, spongy, or uncertain feel at the bottom of the ramrod stroke is never something to shrug off or assume is close enough. It is the signal that a dangerous gap may still exist, and the correct response is one more firm stroke immediately before the rifle is ever considered ready to fire. 3. If you cannot say with real confidence, based on the actual feel of that last ramrod stroke, that your ball is seated firmly against your powder, you do not yet have a safely loaded rifle, no matter how much time pressure is telling you that you do. Solid stop, confirm feel, only then is the rifle ready, and skipping that confirmation to save half a second is exactly the trade that took Hargrove's hand and very likely his life. Gideon drilled this into me at a bench for what felt at the time like an unreasonable number of afternoons, loading and unloading a rifle over and over, sometimes correctly and sometimes with a deliberate short-seated ball he set up on purpose, and making me tell him, by feel alone, which was which, before he would ever let me fire a single live round. He told me once, plain as he told most things, that a rifle does not care how scared you are, and it does not grade on a curve for a man who is in a hurry. It either has a solid stop at the bottom of that ramrod stroke or it does not, and a man's fear is never a good enough reason to skip finding out which. I have carried that lesson into every single time I have loaded a muzzle-loading rifle since, calm or otherwise, and I will tell you plainly, there have been a small handful of times, hunting alone, hands cold and clumsy, when that ramrod stroke felt just slightly wrong to me, and I made myself take the extra half second to strike it again rather than trust a feeling I was not fully sure of. I do not know for certain in any of those moments whether I actually had a gap or whether my hands were simply cold and imprecise. I have never once regretted taking that extra half second to find out. So there is your third thing to carry. Learn the feel of a solid ramrod stop. Practice it deliberately and often until it lives in your hands rather than your conscious thinking. And treat any uncertainty about that feel, especially in a moment of real pressure, as a reason to strike again rather than a detail to let slide. Now, here is where I have to break the pattern of this story for a moment, friend, because everything I have told you so far, the physics of the air gap, the trap of haste under fear, the feel of a true ramrod stop, is knowledge that most careful old-time riflemen carried some working version of, even without the exact science to explain why it mattered. What comes next is where even good, trained, careful men still got caught, because it takes more than knowing the rule to survive the exact moment the rule matters most. The fourth piece is the false fix, and I'm putting it here on purpose, the same as every time before, because it is the single most natural, most understandable wrong turn a frightened man can take, and it very likely describes almost exactly what happened inside Hargrove's mind in those last frantic seconds before his rifle came apart in his hands. Here is the false fix, laid out plain. A man in the middle of a genuine emergency, reloading as fast as his hands will move, strikes the ramrod down, feels something that is not quite the full, solid, confident stop he is used to feeling in calm conditions, and rather than taking the extra half second to strike again and confirm it properly, his mind, racing and afraid, tells him it is close enough. It has to be close enough. There is no time for anything else. The enemy is at the door, or the animal is closing the distance, or whatever the emergency happens to be. And the overwhelming pressure of that moment convinces a man that a slightly uncertain ramrod stroke is a luxury detail he simply cannot afford to double check right now, when in truth, it is the single most important half second he could possibly spend. This is the same wheel I have described before in different clothing, because these traps tend to wear a similar shape no matter what danger is driving them. The body signals urgency, real and legitimate urgency, and the natural, understandable response is to cut whatever corner feels least essential in that instant. And the tragedy is that the corner most likely to get cut, seating the ball fully and confirming it by feel, is precisely the one corner that determines whether the next trigger pull ends in a shot fired safely or a barrel bursting in a man's own hands. A man telling himself close enough in that moment is not being foolish or careless in any ordinary sense. He is doing exactly what fear trains a human body to do under real threat: prioritize speed over precision, and that is exactly why this particular mistake has claimed careful, experienced men just as readily as careless ones. Across every era, firearms of this kind have existed. Picture it plain, because I want this to sit with you the way it ought to. A man in a real fight, hands moving as fast as they can, strikes his ramrod down, feels a stop that is almost right, but not quite the solid, confident thump he knows from calm practice, and in the space of half a heartbeat, weighs that small doubt against the screaming urgency of the moment and lets the doubt go. He raises the rifle. He aims. He pulls the trigger, believing, with every reason in the world to believe it, that he has done exactly what he has done 1,000 times before. And the barrel, carrying that hidden gap of open air between powder and ball, produces a pressure spike it was never built to survive and comes apart in his hands before the shot he intended to fire ever has the chance to matter. That is the false fix closing the trap all the way shut, and it is, by every account and every understanding rifleman of that era carried about this exact danger, almost certainly close to the shape of what happened to Hargrove in that cabin in 1792. Here is your fourth thing to carry, and it runs against instinct just as hard as the pieces before it. In a moment of genuine urgency, when every part of you is screaming to move faster, the temptation to accept an uncertain ramrod stroke as close enough is exactly the false fix, and it is exactly wrong. The half second required to strike that ramrod again and confirm a true solid seat is not a luxury you cannot afford in an emergency. It is the single cheapest insurance available against losing your hand, your eyesight, or your life to your own weapon. And the men who trained this discipline deeply enough that it survived their own fear intact were the men who walked away from moments like Hargrove's with nothing worse than a fast heartbeat. Now, if accepting a doubtful ramrod strike is the wrong turn, what did the old-timers actually build into their own hands and habits to make sure they almost never faced that doubt in the first place, even under real pressure? That is the fifth piece, and it is the piece of practical, hard-won craft this whole story has been building toward. The fifth piece is the deliberate, repeated discipline that turns correct loading into pure muscle memory, so thoroughly ingrained that fear and haste cannot easily override it. And it comes down to a handful of specific practices any serious rifleman on this frontier would have drilled into his own hands long before he ever needed them in a real emergency. Start with the ramrod itself, because the old timers understood something simple and clever that most modern shooters who have never loaded from the muzzle have no reason to know. A great many experienced riflemen mark their own ramrod with a small filed notch or a wrapped thread, positioned at the exact point along the ramrod's length that corresponded to a ball, seated correctly and fully against a proper powder charge in that specific rifle. This turned an uncertain feel into something a man could confirm two ways at once, by touch in total darkness and by sight in daylight, glancing down to see whether that mark sat exactly at the muzzle's edge, exactly where it belonged, or whether it stood proud, revealing at a glance that the ball had stopped short of where it needed to be. A mark like that costs a man a few minutes with a file, made once, and it pays for itself the very first time. Fear makes his hands unreliable, and his eyes at least can confirm what his fingers are too shaken to trust. Second, and this is a matter of pure repetition, serious riflemen practice the full loading sequence: powder, patch, ball, and a firm confirmed ramrod seat over and over, dozens and eventually hundreds of times under calm conditions, specifically so that the correct motion and the correct feel became automatic rather than something requiring conscious thought in the moment it mattered most. This is no different from how a soldier drills the same motion on a parade ground until his hands can execute it half asleep, and it is the same principle behind why any serious discipline involving fast hands under pressure gets practiced calm over and over, long before it is ever needed for real. A man whose hands have loaded correctly 1,000 times in calm practice is far more likely to load correctly the one time it happens in genuine fear, because his body defaults to the deeply worn groove of correct habit rather than improvising under pressure. Third, and this ties directly into the discipline of the ramrod mark, experienced riflemen built a habit of never, under any circumstance, skipping the final confirming stroke, treating it as a non-negotiable final step of loading in the same category as actually pulling the trigger, rather than an optional flourish that could be trimmed away when time was short. A man who has trained himself to treat that final confirming stroke as inseparable from the act of loading itself, as much a part of the sequence as pouring the powder in the first place, is far less likely to skip it under pressure than a man who has always thought of it as a nice extra step when he had the time to spare. Fourth, and this is a piece specific to genuine emergency conditions, careful riflemen who expected they might need to reload fast under real threat often practiced the loading sequence deliberately with an elevated heart rate, running hard beforehand or otherwise working themselves into a state closer to genuine fear response, specifically to test and toughen their hands' ability to hold the correct sequence together, even when adrenaline was working against their fine motor control. This was not common among every rifleman, because it required real discipline and foresight to bother with, but the men who did it, by every old account that survives describing the practice, held up far better under the genuine pressure of a real fight than men whose only practice had ever taken place calm on a quiet afternoon with nothing at stake. Let me put one more piece of this craft in your hands plain, because it rounds out the whole discipline, and it has to do with consistency rather than any single dramatic step. The old-timers understood that a rifle loaded correctly one time and carelessly the next is, in a real sense, worse than a rifle loaded carelessly every single time, because a man who sometimes gets it right and sometimes does not builds a false confidence in his own hands, trusting a feel and a habit that was never actually reliable to begin with. A serious rifleman used the same powder measure, the same careful pour, and the same deliberate ramrod technique on a lazy Sunday afternoon at the bench as he did on the one morning a real threat might be waiting in the tree line, because he understood that the hands do not know the difference between practice and the real thing unless the man training them insists on treating every single load as though it were the one that mattered. This consistency, boring and unremarkable as it sounds, is very often what separates a man whose discipline holds together under fear from a man whose discipline only ever worked when nothing was actually at stake. There's a second habit worth carrying alongside the first, and it involves practicing the motion without ever firing a shot at all. Many careful old-time riflemen practiced what amounted to dry loading drills, running through the full physical sequence, pouring a measured but harmless amount of sand or fine grit in place of powder, seeding a dummy ball, striking the ramrod home to that same familiar solid stop, over and over, specifically so that the hands could rehearse the entire motion, including the critical final confirming stroke, without the cost or the danger of live powder and ball. A man who has run that exact motion hundreds of times, even in dry practice, has built a far deeper and more reliable habit into his hands than a man who has only ever loaded live rounds on the relatively rare occasions he actually goes hunting. And that depth of habit is precisely what tends to survive intact when real fear enters the picture and everything else in a man's mind is racing. So here is your fifth thing to carry, and it is 5 practices braided into one now, the same shape as before. Mark your ramrod at the correct seated depth for your own rifle. Practice the full loading sequence, powder through confirmed ramrod seat, calm and repeatedly until it becomes automatic. Treat the final confirming stroke as non-negotiable, never a step to trim away under pressure. Keep your loading technique identical every single time, on a quiet afternoon and in a real emergency alike, so your hands never learn a shortcut they might reach for when it matters most. And if you genuinely expect to need speed under real threat, practice the sequence with your heart already pounding, so your hands learn to hold the discipline together even when fear is working against them. That is the craft. That is what separated the riflemen who walked away from moments like Hargrove's from the ones who did not, generation after generation, long before anybody had the physics to fully explain why it mattered so much. Now here's another pattern break, friend, because we are at the edge of the last piece, and I want you square with me before we step over it. Everything so far, the hidden danger of the air gap, the trap of haste under real fear, the honest feel of a true ramrod stop, the false fix of accepting close enough, the deliberate craft that beat this danger for generations. Most careful old-time riflemen carried some working version of. What comes next is the reason this exact danger, born on the muzzle-loading frontier, never actually went away. It changed its name and its weapon, and it is very likely killing and maiming people this very year, under conditions that would look nothing like Hargrove's cabin and everything like an ordinary shooting range or hunting trip. The sixth piece, the last piece, is the plain fact that the muzzle-loading rifle disappeared from common use over the generations following the frontier era, replaced first by cartridge-loading rifles and eventually by the fully modern firearms most shooters use today, and that transition, reasonable and genuinely beneficial in almost every way, quietly buried the specific discipline I have just walked you through. The ramrod mark, the practiced feel of a solid seat, because modern cartridge firearms simply do not require a man to seat a ball by hand at all. And yet, and this is the piece that ought to trouble you a little, the exact physical principle that killed Hargrove, an obstruction sitting partway down a barrel when a shot is fired, causing a catastrophic pressure spike at that point, rather than a clean, safe discharge, did not disappear along with the muzzleloader. It simply took on a new, and in some ways, more dangerous form, one that modern shooters who have never heard the word muzzleloader spoken in earnest are still falling victim to today. Under a name almost nobody outside of serious shooting circles has ever learned, that modern form is called a squib load. And here is exactly how it happens. In a modern cartridge firearm, occasionally, due to a manufacturing defect, old or improperly stored ammunition, or a powder charge that fails to ignite fully, a round fires with enough force to push the primer and ignite some portion of the powder, but not enough force to drive the bullet completely out of the barrel. That bullet lodges somewhere partway down the barrel's length, exactly the same kind of obstruction, physically speaking, that a short-seated ball created in Hargrove's muzzle-loading rifle. And here is the part that makes this modern danger, if anything, harder to catch than the old one. A squib load very often produces a distinctly quieter, weaker sound and a noticeably reduced recoil compared to a normal shot, a signal that, to an inattentive or inexperienced shooter, can easily be mistaken for nothing more than a slightly weak or unusual feeling round rather than the serious warning it actually represents. A shooter who does not recognize that reduced sound and recoil as the warning sign it is, and who simply chambers and fires another live round immediately afterward, is doing the modern equivalent of Hargrove pulling his trigger on a short-seated ball, driving a new bullet directly into an obstruction already lodged in the barrel, and producing exactly the same catastrophic pressure spike, exactly the same kind of barrel rupture, exactly the same risk of serious injury to hands, eyes, and face in a rifle, shotgun, or handgun built to standards Hargrove could never have imagined. The federal safety records on modern shooting injuries, along with decades of documentation from firearms manufacturers and shooting safety organizations, confirm this pattern plainly. Squib loads followed by an unaware second shot remain a genuine and recurring cause of serious firearm injury every single year among careful, experienced, responsible shooters, not merely careless beginners, because the warning signs, a weaker report, and reduced recoil are subtle enough to miss entirely if a shooter has not been specifically trained to notice and respect them. This is not a danger that belongs only to the history books and the muzzle-loading frontier. It is the exact same physical principle that killed Hargrove in 1792, wearing new clothes, still very much active in gun safes and shooting ranges across this country today, and the discipline that beats it is, in its own modern form, nearly identical to the discipline the old-timers drilled into their hands. Pay close attention to what your own senses tell you about every single shot you fire, and never ever assume that a shot which felt or sounded wrong is safe to simply follow with another. So that is the sixth piece, the buried heart of the whole thing. The old muzzle-loading rifle is gone from common use, and the specific ramrod discipline that protected riflemen from short-seated balls has largely gone with it. But the underlying danger, an obstruction partway down a barrel, meeting a full charge behind it, never actually left this country's gun safes at all. It simply moved into a form most modern shooters have never been formally warned about, and it continues to injure people every year for the exact same underlying reason it injured and killed frontier riflemen like Hargrove, a failure to notice in the critical moment that something about the shot in front of them was not quite right, and a decision born of haste or inattention rather than malice to proceed anyway. Not a conspiracy, friend, and I want to be as careful and honest with you about that as Gideon was always careful and honest with me. Nobody buried this knowledge on purpose. It simply stopped being common because the specific tool that made it necessary, the muzzle-loading rifle, stopped being common too, and the underlying physical principle, dangerous in any firearm with an obstructed barrel, quietly rode along into the modern age without nearly enough people carrying the warning forward with it. Let me hand you the whole of it back together now, the way it ought to sit in your mind after tonight. A rifle barrel is a sealed tube built to handle a very specific, well-understood pressure curve, one that assumes the projectile sits properly seated against its powder charge, and any meaningful gap of open air between the two, however small, can turn a normal, safe shot into a catastrophic pressure spike capable of bursting the barrel itself. This danger is invisible from the outside, giving a man no warning by sight, and it strikes hardest in exactly the moments a rifleman is most rushed and most afraid, because haste under real pressure is precisely the condition most likely to produce a short-seated ball. Your own hands can learn to feel the honest difference between a true solid ramrod seat and a soft, questionable one, if that feel is deliberately practiced and trusted, rather than second-guessed in a moment of fear. The natural instinct to accept an uncertain, Ramrod stroke as close enough under pressure is the false fix, and it is exactly what most likely killed Hargrove and men like him across the whole span of the muzzle-loading frontier. The old craft that beat this danger for generations was disciplined and specific. A marked ramrod, relentless calm practice until the correct motion became automatic, treating the final confirming stroke as non-negotiable, and even practicing under an elevated heart rate for men who expected to need real speed under real threat. And underneath all of it sits the reason this danger never actually left us, which is that the exact same physical principle, an obstruction meeting a fresh charge inside a sealed barrel, followed modern shooters straight out of the muzzle-loading era and into every gun safe in this country today, wearing the name squib load rather than short-seated ball, and taking hands, eyes, and occasionally lives from people who have never once heard the frontier history behind the exact danger they just walked into. This was never really a story about an ambush, friend, because the ambush in the end was not what killed Hargrove at all. It was about the difference between a rifle a man merely believes is loaded correctly and a rifle he has actually confirmed is loaded correctly, and that difference is exactly what separated Hargrove from every other defender in that cabin who survived the same fight under the same fear with the same rifle design in their hands. If you ever load any firearm, muzzleloader, or modern cartridge alike under real pressure this year, you will not simply trust that your hands did what they always do and move on. You will know to feel for that true solid seat or to notice a shot that sounded or felt wrong before you ever chamber another round behind it. That is not fear talk, and it is not doom talk. That is the same ordinary hard-won discipline your great-great-grandfather built into his own hands, the same way Gideon built it into mine. Discipline that got quietly separated from the modern conversation about firearms as the tools themselves changed, and that you just pick back up again tonight. You do not need to overhaul everything you know about firearms this week, friend. Do one thing. If you shoot any muzzle-loading firearm, take the time this week to mark your ramrod at the correct seated depth for that specific rifle, so your hands and your eyes both have a reliable way to confirm a proper load, calm or otherwise. And if you shoot modern cartridge firearms instead, learn to recognize the sound and feel of a squib load, a noticeably weaker report, and reduced recoil, and drill into yourself right now before you ever need it the absolute rule that any shot which felt or sounded even slightly wrong means you stop immediately and check the barrel before you ever load or fire again. That single habit, learned calm today, is worth more than any amount of speed you could ever gain by skipping it under pressure. Your grandfather likely understood some version of this, whether he carried a muzzleloader himself or simply passed down the plain old rule that a gun deserves your full attention every single time you touch it. Somebody just did not get the chance to hand you the reason behind that rule the way Gideon handed it down to me. Tell me down below, neighbor. Did your own family carry old muzzle-loading rifles, and did anybody ever teach you to feel for a true ramrod seat, or was that particular piece of knowledge one that got lost somewhere between your grandfather's hands and your own? Have you ever fired a shot that felt or sounded a little bit wrong, and did you know in that moment exactly what that feeling meant? Different families carried this warning in different words if they carried it at all, and the story that gets the most of you talking down there is the one I go deepest on next. And before you go, one more thing, because it follows naturally from everything we have covered tonight. Next time we are going after the black powder itself, the plain gray substance that made every rifle on this frontier possible, and the one careless habit around storing and handling it that has burned down more cabins, blown apart more powder horns, and taken more fingers than any enemy raid ever managed against a well-defended frontier home. A habit that modern black powder shooters are still, right this year, occasionally repeating with the exact same results. If you want that one, and I expect you will, tap subscribe because we are pulling these old buried pieces of knowing back into the light one at a time, and there are more of you finding your way here every week, and that matters a great deal more than you might think. Done by hand, told straight.